Messerschmitt Bf 109E could outclimb, outmaneuver, and outgun almost every Allied fighter in 1940, yet Germany lost the war. This was not a failure of engineering. It was a catastrophic failure of leadership that turned technological superiority into strategic disaster. While Allied pilots struggled against German aircraft that could reach 37,000 feet and fire 20mm cannons with devastating accuracy, the man commanding these aerial weapons was systematically destroying his own air force from within. The morning mist over Dover revealed formations of Heinkel bombers, escorted by sleek Messerschmitt fighters. Their engines roared across the English Channel like mechanical thunder. Below, British radar operators tracked hundreds of blips moving toward London, knowing their Spitfires were outnumbered 3-1. This investigation reveals how Hermann Göring's ego, strategic blindness, and fundamental misunderstanding of air warfare transformed Germany's most advanced military branch into a tool of national defeat. The story is not about inferior technology. It is about how one man's incompetence can waste an entire generation of engineering brilliance and condemn millions to unnecessary death. Hermann Göring inherited the most technologically advanced air force in the world in 1935. It was equipped with aircraft that represented the cutting edge of aviation engineering. The Messerschmitt Bf 109E could climb at 3,100 feet per minute, faster than any Allied fighter, while carrying two 20mm cannons and two 7.92mm machine guns. German pilots trained on these machines for years before the war began, accumulating flight hours that their Allied counterparts could only dream of achieving. Yet by 1945, this same air force lay in ruins. Its pilots were dead, its factories bombed, and its reputation shattered. The transformation from aerial supremacy to complete defeat was not gradual. It was a series of catastrophic decisions made by a man who understood politics better than warfare. Göring's background as a World War I ace had taught him about individual combat, but modern air warfare required industrial thinking, strategic patience, and technological foresight. The Reichsmarschall's first major error revealed itself during the Spanish Civil War. There, German pilots gained valuable combat experience while testing new aircraft designs. However, Göring drew the wrong conclusions from these victories. He saw tactical success and assumed strategic invincibility, failing to understand that fighting Spanish Republicans with obsolete aircraft bore no resemblance to confronting the Royal Air Force over Britain. This misinterpretation would prove fatal when real warfare began. The Battle of Britain exposed Göring's fundamental misunderstanding of air power doctrine. On August 13, 1940, Eagle Day commenced with 1,485 German aircraft crossing the English Channel in the largest air assault in history. German pilots flying Bf 109s and Bf 110s possessed superior aircraft, better training, and numerical advantage. The Luftwaffe's initial strategy targeted British airfields and radar installations. This was a sound approach that threatened to cripple RAF Fighter Command within weeks. British Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding later admitted that continued attacks on airfields would have forced the RAF to withdraw north of London, effectively conceding air superiority to Germany. Radar stations at Ventnor and Rye suffered severe damage, creating dangerous gaps in Britain's early warning system. German bombers struck Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Northolt repeatedly, destroying hangars, fuel depots, and communications equipment essential for RAF operations. However, Göring's impatience and ego intervened at the crucial moment. After 2 weeks of systematic airfield attacks, he abruptly shifted strategy to terror bombing London's civilian areas. This decision, made against the advice of his most experienced commanders, allowed the RAF to repair damaged airfields and reorganize their defenses. What should have been Germany's greatest victory became the beginning of their aerial defeat, all because one man could not resist the psychological appeal of bombing enemy civilians. The strategic bombing campaign against London revealed Göring's complete ignorance of industrial warfare principles. While German Heinkel, He-111 bombers dropped 13,000 tons of bombs on London during September 1940, British aircraft factories continued producing Spitfires and Hurricanes at unprecedented rates. Lord Beaverbrook's Ministry of Aircraft Production had dispersed manufacturing across hundreds of small workshops, making the British aviation industry virtually immune to strategic bombing. Göring believed that terrorizing civilians would force British surrender, but he fundamentally misunderstood British psychology and industrial capacity. The Blitz killed 43,000 civilians and destroyed countless homes, yet British aircraft production actually increased during the bombing campaign. Supermarine factories produced 163 Spitfires in September 1940, compared to 131 in August, while German aircraft losses mounted without corresponding strategic gains. Meanwhile, German pilots flying superior aircraft found themselves trapped in a war of attrition they could not win. Bf 109E fighters carried only 88 gallons of fuel, providing approximately 20 minutes of combat time over London before requiring return to French airfields. British pilots, fighting over their own territory, could engage multiple times per day, while German pilots managed only 1 or 2 sorties. This fundamental logistical disadvantage, ignored by Göring's planning staff, gradually eroded German pilot strength through exhaustion and combat losses. Göring's personnel management revealed a pattern of favoritism and incompetence that infected the entire Luftwaffe command structure. He promoted officers based on personal loyalty rather than tactical ability, creating a culture where contradicting the Reichsmarschall's opinions meant career suicide. Colonel Adolf Galland, Germany's most successful fighter ace, later described meetings where experienced pilots were forbidden from reporting unfavorable intelligence about British capabilities. The Reichsmarschall's vanity demanded constant reassurance about German superiority, leading to systematic suppression of accurate battlefield reports. When pilots reported that British Spitfires could outmaneuver Bf 109s in certain circumstances, Göring accused them of cowardice and defeatism. This willful blindness prevented necessary tactical adjustments and technological improvements that might have maintained German advantages. Intelligence failures compounded these leadership problems. Göring's staff consistently underestimated British aircraft production, radar capabilities, and pilot training programs. They believed the RAF possessed fewer than 700 operational fighters when the actual number exceeded 1,400. Such massive intelligence failures were not accidental. They reflected an organizational culture where accurate information was unwelcome if it contradicted Göring's preconceptions about German invincibility. The Stalingrad airlift demonstrated Göring's most catastrophic strategic miscalculation. When the German Sixth Army became encircled in November 1942, Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply 300 tons of materials daily to the trapped forces. This promise was made without consulting logistics experts, weather specialists, or transport pilots who understood the operational realities of winter flying in Russia. The mathematics of the airlift revealed its impossibility from the beginning. Supplying 300 tons daily required approximately 150 Junkers Ju-52 transport flights, assuming perfect weather and no combat losses. However, Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns destroyed German transports faster than they could be replaced, while winter storms grounded aircraft for days at a time. The Luftwaffe managed to deliver an average of only 94 tons per day, far below the minimum required for survival. General Friedrich Paulus and his 250,000 soldiers slowly starved while Göring maintained his impossible promises. The Reichsmarschall's reputation for reliability had convinced Hitler to reject opportunities for tactical withdrawal that might have saved the Sixth Army. Instead, 93,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity, while the Luftwaffe lost 488 transport aircraft and their irreplaceable crews. This single decision destroyed Germany's strategic reserve and demonstrated to the world that German promises were worthless. Aircraft production failures under Göring's management revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of industrial warfare. While American factories produced 96,318 aircraft in 1942, German production reached only 15,409 aircraft. This was a ratio that made long-term victory impossible. The Reichsmarschall encouraged competition between aircraft manufacturers, believing that rivalry would spur innovation, but this approach created logistical nightmares and production inefficiencies. German factories produced dozens of different aircraft variants, each requiring unique spare parts, specialized tools, and trained mechanics. A typical Luftwaffe squadron might operate 3 different fighter types simultaneously, making maintenance and supply incredibly complex. American forces, by contrast, standardized on fewer aircraft types, allowing mass production techniques that reduced costs while increasing reliability and availability. Göring's failure to disperse aircraft production facilities made German industry vulnerable to Allied bombing campaigns. Major aircraft factories remained concentrated in easily identifiable locations, presenting perfect targets for American B-17 bombers. The February 1944 Big Week bombing campaign destroyed 75% of German fighter production capacity in 6 days, crippling the Luftwaffe's ability to replace combat losses. This vulnerability was not inevitable. It resulted from Göring's refusal to implement dispersal strategies that other German industries had adopted successfully. The development of jet aircraft technology exposed Göring's inability to recognize revolutionary innovations. German engineers had created the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, capable of 540 miles per hour. This was nearly 200 miles per hour faster than any Allied propeller aircraft. This technological breakthrough could have restored German air superiority if properly implemented and mass-produced during 1943. However, Göring's interference turned this advantage into another strategic failure. He insisted that the Me 262 be modified as a bomber rather than a fighter, believing that fast bombers would terrorize Allied ground forces more effectively than air superiority fighters. This decision delayed production by 8 months, while engineers struggled to adapt a fighter design for bombing missions. It was never intended to perform. When Me 262 aircraft finally entered combat in late 1944, fewer than 300 were available, far too few to affect the war's outcome. Allied pilots learned to attack German jets during takeoff and landing, when their speed advantage disappeared. The aircraft that might have changed aviation history became instead another symbol of Göring's strategic incompetence, arriving too late and in insufficient numbers to matter. Pilot training programs under Göring's direction revealed his complete ignorance of human resource management in modern warfare. While American pilot training programs expanded to produce 193,000 pilots during the war, German training remained limited by fuel shortages, aircraft availability, and Göring's belief that quality mattered more than quantity. This philosophy proved disastrously wrong when experienced German pilots began dying faster than they could be replaced. By 1944, new German pilots received an average of 112 flight hours before entering combat, compared to 360 hours for American pilots. These inexperienced aviators, flying against veteran Allied pilots in superior numbers, died at catastrophic rates. The Luftwaffe lost 2,395 pilots during the first 6 months of 1944, including many irreplaceable veterans who had survived years of combat. Göring's response to these losses demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of aerial warfare. Instead of expanding training programs or conserving experienced pilots for instruction duties, he demanded more aggressive tactics and longer combat tours. This approach accelerated pilot losses while reducing training quality, creating a death spiral that destroyed German air power more effectively than any Allied strategy. The failure to develop long-range heavy bombers represented Göring's most significant strategic blindness. While American B-17 and B-24 bombers could strike targets 1,500 miles from their bases, German bombers remained limited to tactical ranges of fewer than 800 miles. This limitation prevented Germany from attacking Soviet industrial centers beyond the Urals or American production facilities, allowing both enemies to build overwhelming material advantages. Göring had canceled the Ural bomber project in 1937, believing that tactical aircraft would prove more useful than strategic bombers. This decision reflected his World War I mentality, where air power supported ground operations rather than conducting independent strategic campaigns. He failed to understand that modern warfare required the ability to destroy enemy production capacity, not just frontline forces. The consequences of this strategic myopia became apparent when Soviet factories relocated beyond German bomber range, continued producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery throughout the war. American industry, completely immune to German attack, supplied not only U.S. forces but also British and Soviet armies. Germany found itself fighting enemies who could replace losses, while German production declined under constant bombardment. Göring's relationship with radar technology demonstrated his inability to appreciate defensive innovations. German scientists had developed effective radar systems before the war, but the Reichsmarschall showed little interest in defensive applications, preferring offensive weapons that promised quick victories. This attitude left Germany vulnerable to Allied bombing campaigns that might have been defeated with proper radar-guided fighter interception. The Kammhuber line, Germany's radar-based air defense system, received inadequate resources and attention from Göring's staff, while British radar networks integrated fighter control, anti-aircraft guns, and early warning systems into comprehensive defensive networks. German radar remained fragmented and poorly coordinated. Allied bombers learned to exploit gaps in German coverage, penetrating deep into Reich territory with minimal losses. When Allied electronic warfare began jamming German radar systems, Göring's forces lacked backup procedures or alternative technologies. British window chaff strips, dropped from bombers, created false radar returns that confused German operators and allowed real bombers to escape detection. This technological defeat resulted not from German engineering failures, but from Göring's neglect of defensive planning and electronic countermeasures research. The Eastern Front revealed Göring's complete failure to understand the scale and nature of warfare against the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa required the Luftwaffe to support ground operations across a 1,000-mile front, while maintaining air superiority over an area larger than Western Europe. This mission demanded careful resource allocation, strategic planning, and realistic assessment of enemy capabilities. These were qualities that Göring consistently lacked. Initial German successes masked fundamental problems with Luftwaffe doctrine and organization. German pilots destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft during the first weeks of invasion, but these victories occurred against obsolete equipment and poorly trained pilots. Göring interpreted these tactical successes as proof of permanent German superiority, failing to recognize that the Soviet Union was rapidly modernizing its air force with American Lend-Lease aircraft and improved training programs. By 1943, Soviet pilots flying American P-39 Cobras and British Hurricanes had achieved rough parity with German fighters, while Soviet production exceeded German output by substantial margins. The Luftwaffe found itself fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with superior numbers, adequate equipment, and improving tactics. Göring's failure to anticipate this transformation left German forces without adequate air support during crucial battles like Kursk and Stalingrad. Intelligence gathering under Göring's leadership suffered from systematic bias and wishful thinking that prevented accurate assessment of enemy capabilities. The Reichsmarschall demanded optimistic reports that confirmed his preconceptions about German superiority, creating an organizational culture where accurate intelligence was unwelcome. This willful blindness led to catastrophic miscalculations about Allied strength, production capacity, and strategic intentions. German intelligence consistently underestimated American aircraft production, believing that democratic societies lacked the discipline necessary for total war mobilization. Göring's staff reported that American factories could produce perhaps 20,000 aircraft annually, when actual production exceeded 96,000 aircraft in 1942 alone. These massive intelligence failures were not accidental. They reflected systematic suppression of uncomfortable facts that contradicted Nazi ideology. The failure to understand Allied technological development proved equally damaging. German intelligence dismissed reports of American long-range fighters, believing that escort aircraft lacked the range necessary to accompany bombers to German targets. When P-51 Mustangs began appearing over Berlin in early 1944, German pilots were psychologically unprepared for combat against fresh enemy fighters, operating at maximum efficiency over German territory. Göring's management of aircraft fuel supplies demonstrated his inability to understand logistical constraints in modern warfare. Germany's synthetic fuel production never exceeded 124,000 barrels per day, far below the requirements for sustained air operations against multiple enemies. The Reichsmarschall consistently promised fuel allocations that exceeded available supplies, forcing operational commanders to choose between pilot training and combat missions. By 1944, fuel shortages had reduced German pilot training to dangerous levels, while limiting combat operations to essential missions only. New pilots received minimal flight time before entering combat, while experienced aviators flew obsolete aircraft because newer fighters consumed too much precious fuel. This resource crisis was not inevitable. It resulted from Göring's failure to prioritize fuel production and his unrealistic promises about operational capabilities. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești provided Germany's only significant natural petroleum source, but Göring failed to develop adequate defenses for these crucial facilities. When American bombers attacked Ploiești in August 1943, German fighter defenses proved inadequate despite advance warning of the raid. The loss of Romanian oil production accelerated Germany's fuel crisis and demonstrated Göring's inability to protect strategic resources essential for continued resistance. The development of German anti-aircraft defenses revealed Göring's preference for offensive operations over defensive planning. While German 88mm guns proved effective against Allied bombers, the Luftwaffe never developed comprehensive air defense doctrine that integrated fighters, anti-aircraft artillery, and radar systems into unified defensive networks. This fragmented approach allowed Allied bombers to exploit gaps in German coverage and achieve strategic objectives despite heavy losses. Göring's rivalry with other Nazi leaders prevented effective coordination between Luftwaffe fighters and Army anti-aircraft units. Fighter controllers and artillery commanders used different communication systems, operated on separate frequencies, and followed conflicting engagement procedures. Allied bomber formations often escaped German fighters only to fly safely between anti-aircraft gun positions that could not coordinate their fire effectively. The failure to develop night fighter capabilities until 1942 allowed British bombers to attack German targets with minimal interference for 3 crucial years. When German night fighters finally became effective, using radar-guided interception techniques, Allied electronic warfare had already developed countermeasures that reduced German defensive effectiveness. This technological lag resulted from Göring's initial dismissal of night bombing as ineffective, another strategic miscalculation that cost Germany dearly. Göring's handling of aircraft maintenance and logistics revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of industrial warfare requirements. German aircraft achieved impressive performance specifications, but required extensive maintenance that reduced operational availability below acceptable levels. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, despite its combat effectiveness, needed 30 hours of maintenance for every hour of flight time, compared to 10 hours for American P-51 Mustangs. This maintenance burden reflected design priorities that emphasized performance over reliability, a philosophy that worked during short campaigns, but proved disastrous during prolonged warfare. German aircraft used precision components that required skilled mechanics and specialized tools, making field repairs difficult and time-consuming. American aircraft, designed for mass production and field maintenance, achieved higher operational rates despite inferior individual performance. Supply chain management under Göring's direction suffered from the same problems that plagued aircraft production. Different aircraft types required unique spare parts that could not be standardized or interchanged, creating inventory nightmares for supply officers. When combat losses exceeded production, German squadrons often operated mixed aircraft types that complicated maintenance, training, and tactical coordination. The failure to develop effective bomber escort tactics demonstrated Göring's inability to learn from combat experience. German bombers operating without fighter escorts suffered catastrophic losses during daylight operations, yet the Luftwaffe never developed long-range fighters capable of accompanying bombers to distant targets. This tactical blindness allowed Allied fighters to destroy German bomber formations with minimal risk. Göring's insistence on using twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf 110s as long-range fighters proved disastrously wrong when these aircraft encountered single-engine Allied fighters. The Bf-110's size and weight made it vulnerable to more agile opponents, while its limited maneuverability prevented effective bomber escort duties. German bomber crews learned to fear missions beyond single-engine fighter range, knowing that Allied interceptors would attack without opposition. The development of drop tanks for single-engine fighters could have solved this problem, but Göring's staff dismissed such modifications as unnecessary complications. They believed that German bomber formations possessed sufficient defensive firepower to protect themselves, another miscalculation that cost hundreds of aircraft and thousands of trained aircrew members. Weather reconnaissance and meteorological planning under Göring's direction revealed his tendency to ignore environmental factors that affected air operations. German weather services provided inadequate forecasting for military operations, leading to mission failures that could have been avoided with better planning. The Luftwaffe launched major operations during unfavorable weather conditions, resulting in aircraft losses from storms rather than enemy action. The Battle of Britain suffered from poor weather planning that reduced German operational effectiveness during crucial periods. Göring's staff scheduled maximum effort raids during weather conditions that prevented accurate bombing and effective fighter escort. British defenders, operating from nearby airfields with superior weather information, gained tactical advantages that compensated for their numerical inferiority. Eastern Front operations revealed even more serious weather-related failures. German aircraft designed for temperate climates proved unreliable during Russian winters, while inadequate cold weather equipment grounded entire squadrons during critical battles. Soviet forces, equipped for winter operations, maintained air superiority during weather conditions that neutralized German technological advantages. The training of German ground crews and support personnel reflected Göring's neglect of unglamorous but essential military functions. While German pilots received extensive training, mechanics and armorers learned their trades through abbreviated programs that emphasized speed over thoroughness. This approach created maintenance problems that reduced aircraft availability and increased accident rates throughout the war. German airfields lacked adequate facilities for aircraft maintenance, fuel storage, and ammunition handling. Many forward airstrips operated without proper hangars, forcing mechanics to work outdoors during harsh weather conditions. These environmental challenges, combined with inadequate training, reduced German aircraft readiness rates below levels necessary for sustained operations. Communication systems between airfields and higher headquarters remained primitive throughout the war, preventing effective coordination of maintenance schedules and supply deliveries. Squadron commanders often lacked accurate information about aircraft availability, spare parts inventory, and fuel supplies, making operational planning extremely difficult. Göring's relationship with German aircraft designers revealed his tendency to interfere with technical development based on personal preferences rather than operational requirements. He demanded constant modifications to proven aircraft designs, believing that incremental improvements would maintain German technological superiority. These changes often delayed production and introduced reliability problems that reduced overall effectiveness. The Heinkel He-177 bomber project exemplified Göring's destructive interference with aircraft development. Originally designed as a conventional four-engine bomber, the He-177 was modified to meet Göring's requirement for dive bombing capability. This modification necessitated a complex coupled engine design that proved unreliable and dangerous, killing numerous test pilots and delaying production by years. Fighter development suffered similar problems when Göring insisted on multi-role capabilities that compromised specialized performance. The Messerschmitt Me-210, intended to replace the successful Bf-110, incorporated so many conflicting requirements that it became virtually unflyable. These development failures wasted resources and engineering talent that Germany could not afford to lose. The allocation of resources between different Luftwaffe missions revealed Göring's inability to establish clear priorities during wartime. German aircraft production attempted to satisfy simultaneous demands for fighters, bombers, transport aircraft, and reconnaissance planes without adequate consideration of strategic requirements. This diffusion of effort prevented Germany from achieving superiority in any single mission category. Fighter production received insufficient priority during the crucial period of 1942 to 1943, when Allied bombing campaigns began threatening German industrial capacity. Göring continued emphasizing bomber production for offensive operations while German cities burned under Allied attack. This misallocation of resources allowed Allied air forces to achieve strategic superiority that proved impossible to reverse. Transport aircraft production remained inadequate throughout the war, limiting German ability to supply forward units and conduct airborne operations. The Stalingrad airlift failed partly because Germany lacked sufficient transport aircraft for such massive supply requirements. Göring's promises exceeded available resources by enormous margins, creating impossible expectations that led to strategic disasters. The development of German air doctrine under Göring's leadership reflected his World War I experience rather than modern warfare requirements. German air power doctrine emphasized tactical support for ground operations while neglecting strategic bombing, air defense, and independent air campaigns. This limited perspective prevented effective use of air power as a decisive strategic weapon. Göring's belief in quick victories through tactical air support proved inadequate when Germany faced prolonged warfare against multiple enemies. The Luftwaffe excelled during short campaigns like Poland and France, but lacked doctrine for sustained operations against determined opponents. When blitzkrieg tactics failed to achieve rapid victory, German air power doctrine provided no alternative strategies. The failure to develop effective strategic bombing doctrine allowed Allied industrial capacity to grow unchallenged, while German production declined under constant attack. Göring never understood that modern warfare required destruction of enemy production capacity rather than just frontline forces. This strategic blindness condemned Germany to fight enemies who could replace losses, while German strength diminished irreversibly. Göring's personal corruption and lifestyle revealed character flaws that infected the entire Luftwaffe organization. His obsession with luxury, art collecting, and personal aggrandizement created a culture where personal enrichment took precedence over military effectiveness. Senior officers learned that pleasing Göring personally mattered more than achieving operational success. The Reichsmarschall's drug addiction, particularly his dependence on morphine and other painkillers, impaired his judgment during crucial decision-making periods. Staff officers reported that Göring often appeared confused or detached during important meetings, making decisions based on incomplete information or personal whims, rather than strategic analysis. This personal deterioration accelerated after 1942, when German military fortunes began declining. Göring retreated from active leadership, leaving operational decisions to subordinates, while maintaining formal authority. This leadership vacuum prevented necessary reforms and adaptations that might have improved Luftwaffe effectiveness during the war's final years. The relationship between the Luftwaffe and other German military services revealed Göring's inability to cooperate effectively with Army and Navy commanders. Inter-service rivalry prevented coordinated operations that might have achieved strategic objectives beyond the capability of any single service. Göring's personal ambitions often conflicted with broader German military requirements. Naval aviation remained underdeveloped because Göring refused to allow the Navy independent air assets, insisting that all aircraft operations fall under Luftwaffe control. This bureaucratic jealousy prevented effective anti-submarine warfare and naval reconnaissance that might have improved Germany's position in the Battle of the Atlantic. Army-Luftwaffe cooperation suffered from conflicting priorities and inadequate communication systems. Ground commanders complained that air support arrived too late or attacked wrong targets, while Luftwaffe officers blamed Army units for providing inaccurate target information. These coordination failures reduced the effectiveness of both services during crucial battles. The final collapse of German air power in 1945 represented the culmination of 5 years of strategic errors, resource mismanagement, and leadership failures under Göring's direction. By war's end, the Luftwaffe possessed fewer than 1,500 operational aircraft, compared to over 28,000 Allied aircraft on the Western Front alone. This overwhelming numerical disadvantage resulted from systematic failures in production, training, and strategic planning. German pilots during the war's final months averaged fewer than 50 flight hours before entering combat, while Allied pilots received over 300 hours of training. These inexperienced aviators, flying against veteran opponents in superior numbers, died at rates that made continued resistance meaningless. The Luftwaffe had become a training organization for Allied fighter pilots rather than an effective military force. Fuel shortages during 1945 grounded most remaining German aircraft, while spare parts shortages made maintenance impossible. Göring's promises of secret weapons and miraculous reversals proved as empty as his earlier guarantees about air superiority and strategic bombing. The man who had inherited the world's most advanced air force had transformed it into a symbol of German defeat and incompetence. The legacy of Göring's leadership extends far beyond military history into questions about competence, accountability, and the human cost of strategic failure. His decisions directly contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of German aircrew members, millions of civilians killed in bombing raids, and countless soldiers who died without adequate air support. These casualties resulted not from enemy superiority, but from German leadership failures that were preventable and inexcusable. Modern military analysts study Göring's career as an example of how personal character flaws can undermine technological advantages and strategic opportunities. His combination of ego, incompetence, and corruption created systemic failures that no amount of individual heroism or engineering excellence could overcome. The Luftwaffe's defeat demonstrates that superior equipment means nothing without competent leadership and realistic strategy. The transformation of German air power from dominance to destruction under Göring's command serves as a permanent reminder that wars are won by organizations, not individuals, and that leadership failures at the highest levels can waste any technological advantage. In the end, Germany's best plane lost the war because the worst possible leader commanded it, turning engineering triumph into strategic catastrophe through decisions that prioritized personal ambition over national survival.